Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast.
Small biotech companies need to move fast. At the same time, they are building an entire supply chain from scratch, and they often rely on external partners to do this. Getting the manufacturing process right is really difficult. They need to deliver it on time, within budget, and to regulatory standards. This is one of the toughest operational challenges in the industry. Stephen Weissman has spent over 3 decades solving exactly these kinds of problems. He's been in the process chemistry groups at Merck, Concert Pharmaceuticals, Lexicon, and now leads the CMC function at Cognition Therapeutics, where he heads up drug substance and drug product development and clinical supply for a neurodegeneration candidate. In this episode, Stephen talks about how to manage CMOs effectively, how he thinks about building a supply chain from scratch inside a small biotech, and what he's learnt about CMC strategy from working on drugs that have made it to market, and for some that didn't. Steve, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me, Dora.
No problem at all. So could you just start by telling me a bit about yourself and about Cognition Therapeutics, please?
Sure. I started my professional career back in 1990. I had the good fortune of being hired into Merck, initially in the manufacturing division, and then in transitioning over into the process research group. And I spent a total of 18 years at Merck. And in the intervening now 18 years that I left Merck, I have been working in the small pharma space, all in the CMC function. And currently I am at Cognition Therapeutics, based outside of New York City. We are a small pharma company focused on a single asset, which is known as CT1812. We have recently completed 3 phase 2 trials with this molecule, one in Alzheimer's disease, the second in Lewy dementia, and also in dry AMD, also known as geographic atrophy, which is an ocular disease.
Really interesting. And so tell me, so you've worked at big pharma and at small pharma. What's the biggest sort of difference you have day to day?
Yeah, so it's the urgency of being at a small pharma company. Oftentimes, small pharma companies are a single asset company or a single asset enterprise, and whereas opposed to Merck may have 40 or 50 compounds in its clinical pipeline at any one given time. So if one of those goes down, it's only maybe 2 or 3% of their portfolio. But if at a single asset company, the failure is not an option, right? Otherwise, the company is no longer viable. And so the result of that is that you're often financially constrained. And this puts me and others like me in the difficult position of trying to make critical decisions with incomplete information. Oftentimes, you don't have the money to have all the answers to make these important decisions, and you have to get comfortable with the uncertainty and the risk associated with making those decisions under those circumstances.
How can you make decisions blind when, as you said, failure is not an option?
Yeah, they're not blind. You always want more information, and the more information you have, the better decision you can make. And sometimes you have to go on your intuition, relying on your previous experiences. You try and de-risk along the way as best you can in a low-cost manner, but it's an uncomfortable place to be in, but it's also can be very exciting as well. So it can cut both ways.
Yeah, I bet. And so I know that you cut the cost of goods for your lead compound by 85%, if I'm right.
Right.
Tell me about that.
Sure. So oftentimes that first kilogram that is made, that usually is for tox screening. The fixed goods are being spread over 1 kilogram. So the first easy lever to pull there to reduce costs is economies of scale. When you start making 40, 50, 80 kilograms, those fixed costs are spread over a wider base. So just by being there and going up in scale, you can reduce your costs. But in this particular case, we were also able to reduce the cost of our 2 starting materials significantly. We were able to, when we moved from our first generation process to our second generation process, there were 4 fewer bond forming steps, and we were able to eliminate 3 unit operations. And then also we relocated our manufacturing from the United States to China. And those were the drivers that allowed us to reduce the cost of that first kilo by about 85%.
That must have really increased your runway. Tell me about that move from your manufacturing operations from America to China. How have you found that in general?
Yeah, so I was very fortunate in that my first two jobs after leaving Merck, I had experience working in China. In one case, I think in one case it was a legacy, right? They were already working in China when I arrived. And not every company is comfortable working in Asia. And so for about 10 years, I got comfortable working with the providers in Asia. And there are some highly respectable and reliable vendors in China. A lot of big pharma, including Merck, have been working in China for over 25 years. And so it's important to know who to work with. It's important to do your due diligence, including auditing remotely sometimes during the COVID era, but on site when possible. I was traveling to China on average about once a year prior to 2020. And as a result of that, I felt confident when I arrived at Cognition to make that switch. I had inherited a legacy vendor here outside of Chicago, and we needed a capacity that they weren't able to provide in terms of output. And I made the decision to develop a second generation process and to take that process to China. And the manufacturing costs there are significantly lower still to this day. And so it was those combination of reasons that led us to make that move.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, especially more recently, there's been a lot of talk about regionalization, a push for onshoring, with tariffs, and it's sort of a general EU for EU, America for America, Asia for Asia sort of rhetoric. Has that recent conversation made you think about your strategy, or do you have other priorities?
Absolutely. That's a great question. In the last couple of years, the Biosecure Act has gotten a lot of attention in Congress, and a lot of the pharma companies, both big and small, have started to rethink their strategies with where they locate their CDMOs. And also the threat of tariffs, as you mentioned, and just the geopolitical uncertainty that is present in the world currently. I am keeping an eye on all those aspects. I speak to thought leaders in the industry when I go to the various conferences and trade shows, such as DCAT and Chem Outsourcing and CPHI, and just try and get a sense of what other people are seeing and hearing and thinking. I do know that because of the Biosecure Act, a lot of companies were very, somewhat panicked and wanted to start getting quotes from, domestic CDMOs. But those always didn't, those RFPs didn't always turn into business. I think for some companies, from what I heard, it was a little bit of a box checking exercise, just to say that they've done their due diligence and they have somebody available should they want to make that switch from ex-US back to the United States. Yeah, there's certainly been some reshoring of API, but I'm still, so what I've done to de-risk here at Cognition is I've identified a domestic supplier of API. We've done some due diligence and feasibility. And so at some point, as part of a overall supply chain strategy, we'll be onboarding a secondary supplier of our API that is here in the United States somewhere down the line, and probably sometime around the NDA filing point where you want to start doing validation of your process.
That dual sourcing strategy seems to be sort of very common, especially sort of post-COVID. On the Biosecure you mentioned, has that impacted your company specifically, or is it just something you're thinking about?
Specifically, we keep an eye on the news on a daily basis and see where that's going. I think about 2 years ago is when the Biosecure Act kind of came down hard on one particular company in China. It hasn't really gone much beyond that in terms of who's fallen under the microscope here with Congress. And we keep an eye on things and evaluate constantly. But in the intervening 18 months or so, that's died down a little bit. Hasn't gotten the same publicity as it did previously. And we're comfortable with our current supply chain strategy.
Somewhat in relation to that, but on a sort of a different level, different side, I wanted to talk about tech transfer for a minute. Obviously, you moved your manufacturing facility from America to China. Obviously, you thought that move warranted that extra tech transfer, which obviously could have been avoided if you stayed in the US. Tell me, how did that tech transfer go? Where do you tend to see most tech transfers fall down? I see it as one of the biggest challenges people talk to me about.
Yeah, so in this particular case, it was somewhat atypical in that we were working in parallel. So for our phase 1 and phase 2 supplies, we kept the manufacturing going here in the United States at that legacy vendor I told you about. And in the background, with an eye towards the future for phase 3 and commercial supplies, we developed a second generation process that I mentioned earlier. That process was developed here in the United States, and that process was tech transferred to our Asian CDMO. You asked where most tech transfers go wrong, but it starts with the tech transfer package, the quality of the package. And when you develop a process, even though perhaps you're only performing it on a kilogram scale, which goes into the tech package, and yet your next scale will be, say, 100 kilos. So you'll be going 100x beyond your existing experience. A good vendor who develops your process will always be developing the process with an eye towards the next scale and beyond, and anticipating the challenges that next vendor will experience in going from a kilo scale to a 100 kilogram scale. And so that's where you have to choose wisely who your vendors are to do this process development. And where it goes wrong is the failure to understand the scale relevant variables. So for example, when you're working in a lab on a small scale, you may be able to add a solution to a reaction in, say, 5 minutes in order to maintain the temperature of the reaction. But when you go to a 100 kilogram scale and you're adding gallons of a solution to a reaction, that could take hours. And so that creates a very different reaction profile. And so you anticipate that on a small scale by not adding it in the 5 minutes that you can, but adding it over 1 hour or 2 hours and 3 hours with an eye towards the future. And so it's having an appreciation for those scale relevant variables like mixing, heating, changes in raw material quality, setting specifications for those raw materials, setting specifications for your intermediates early on, understanding impurity profiles and rejection of impurities throughout the process early on. And so it can be very painstaking to get it right, but the sooner you get it right, it'll pay off in spades down the road.
Anticipating scalability challenges, for sure. You also mentioned choose your vendor wisely. Let's talk about that for a minute. When you are vetting a new CMO, what tells you, what are those first signs if it's going to work or if it's not going to work?
You don't always know right away, but let's go back to vetting a new CMO. And the things you should look at include their regulatory inspection record. Has the FDA been to visit them or any other foreign regulatory bodies done inspections there? Have they received any 483s? Performing a site visit. It may cost you $5,000 or $10,000 to travel overseas, but that is such a small amount considering the amount of money and the implications of getting that decision wrong. So site visit is very important. Try to assess the technical skills of their process chemists in my world. Who's going to be on your project? And then sometimes it could be something as simple as the responsiveness to feedback. How fast do they get back to you? Do they understand the chemical problems that you're experiencing, or the kinds of chemistry you anticipate bringing to them? Do they have the certain expertise to perform that? Some chemistries are very straightforward, and others a little bit more nuanced and require careful attention to detail, or certain technologies, or a certain experience. So those are the things that go into choosing a seat. For me, it's been 18 years since I've left Merck, and in that time, a great number of my former colleagues have gone on to either start their own CDMOs or be executives at CDMOs throughout the world. And I leverage those relationships pretty much all the time there's an existing knowledge base, right? We were trained in the same way as to how to do process chemistry, and there was a certain rigor that was associated with the work we did there at Merck, and they've brought that experience to these CDMOs, and I routinely use those CDMOs that I know people at already, and there's that built-in confidence right from the get-go.
Yeah, I guess that the trust would be there already, wouldn't it? It's interesting you say that. Actually, we've done some research at PharmaSource on the key challenges between smaller biotechs and more established pharma. And one of the key challenges for smaller biotech is they may actually not have the network yet. You know, if they're just starting their molecule and that pipeline, that the sort of their network doesn't really exist, and that is obviously a huge advantage when it comes to engaging with partners. Let's talk about regulatory filings and process development for a minute, changing gears a little bit. How does your approach sort of change when you're thinking about regulatory filings from the start of the process compared to maybe at the point where you have to, but maybe it's a bit late? Tell me a little bit about that.
So early on, it shouldn't matter. You know, early on when you're preclinical or phase 1 and the regulatory scrutiny is much lower than it is for a commercial process, you always want to put your best foot forward with respect to the process you choose. And so early on, you need to do what's right for the program, and the regulatory usually takes care of itself early on because of the lower level of scrutiny early on. Now, as you get into phase 3 in commercial, obviously the regulatory burden of making a change to your process is far greater. Requires more time, it costs more money, has higher implications. But yeah, when I was at Merck, Merck was always willing to change a process for the better, no matter the stage of development. Phase 3, post-approval, it was always the process first, and the regulatory staff will figure it out, right? You don't want the tail wagging the dog, which is kind of how I see that issue. It's process first, and then the rest can be easily figured out. It's just that the time and effort to do post-approval is far greater than it is, say, in phase 1.
That's interesting you say that. I often hear that you should be thinking about regulatory from, day one, really, just because down the line it's harder to change those processes.
It is. And the payoff has to be greater, right? If you're making a post-approval change after NDA, there needs to be a significant return on your investment. But in neither case, either early or late, there should always be a way to figure it out if the payoff makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know you're an advocate for design of experiments. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. So design of experiments is a systematic, it's really just a form of multivariate analysis where you're looking at changing multiple variables at the same time, as opposed to the traditional manner of changing one factor at a time. I think some of us older scientists and chemists were trained that you look at changing the temperature, and then maybe you look at changing the stoichiometry or changing the amount of the concentration of the reaction, and you change one thing at a time to try and get to an optimized reaction. And that's a very inefficient way of doing things. And so what DOE does, it allows you to look at all of those variables at the same time in a certain set of reactions. And one of the major advantages of DOE is that it allows you to detect interactions of variables. That's where one variable's desired setting is dependent on another variable's setting. And you can't obtain that information using the one factor at a time approach. It's a very systematic way of performing reaction optimization on continuous variables. A continuous variable is what we call the how much the reaction. How much catalyst are we using? How much solvent are we using? How much of this particular reagent are we using? Which is different from the discrete variables. That's the what of the reaction. What catalyst are we using? What base are we using? What solvent are we using? And so those discrete and continuous variables really comprise the entirety of process optimization.
So if DOE was the standard across the industry and used all the time in every company, what would be the overall sort of high-level changes or benefits to the sector and to healthcare?
Yeah, so DOE has been around. The math behind DOE has been around since the 1930s. So it's coming up on 100 years since the founding, and it's been slow to receive uptake in our industry. I would say in the last 5 or 10 years, it's gotten much more prevalent. But when I first started this endeavor back in 2007, when I was at Merck, the process research department did not have this capability internally, and they realized that was a shortcoming. And I heard through the grapevine that they were looking for someone to head up this initiative to bring that knowledge and skill into the department. And I raised my hand to be that person. I've been doing the same kind of work for about 17 years at that point, and we're eager to try something different. And so they said, great, go figure it out and bring it back and let us know what you find, essentially. And so I went to a training course. I scoured the web and found an excellent training course, as it turned out, provided by Scientific Update. I flew myself to London for 3 days. It was a course that was co-taught by a process chemist who was well-versed in DOE, as well as a statistician who worked for the software company who was providing the training. And so that combination of both the science and the math made it a very enabling training. And I came back, and I wasn't quite DOE proficient yet, but I felt enabled to take that on. And we had a very quick success using DOE. The first week I had returned from my training, one of my fellow chemists had this very difficult problem he was trying to solve. And this was for a post-approval process. We talked about how challenging it can be sometimes to change a process post-approval. The molecule had been approved about a month before, and the company was still interested in reducing the inventory cost of the API by about 20%. And they had identified this one particular transformation as being where we could get the most payoff towards that 20% reduction. And it was a chemical transformation in which the selectivity of the reaction was only about 77%. So about 23% of the reaction was going towards a non-productive byproduct. And first of all, separating those two from each other was difficult. And so they ended up throwing away about 30% of the entire output. And that's why it was such a problematic step. And this was one of the most prolific chemists that we had at Merck during my time there. And he'd been working on this problem for about 6 or 8 weeks, had made no traction in solving the problem. And he knocked on my door and said, I heard you're back from DOE training, and I'm having this really difficult problem. What can we do? And so we sat down. I gave him a set of reactions to run, having created a design of experiments, DOE. And 2 weeks later, he came back with the data, and I put it into the software program, and we had solved the problem almost immediately. And that process improvement was subsequently implemented, and they were able to achieve that 20% cost reduction by making that improvement from 77% selectivity to over 99.9% selectivity. And so that got a lot of attention internally, and that kind of kick-started my foray into DOE. And it's been a very fulfilling journey over the last 18 years to understand that technology or that skill and apply it in various aspects of my career.
Seeing those specific efficiency improvements must be really, really satisfying. So tell me, you've worked on drugs that made it to market, and you've also worked on drugs that didn't make it to market. What's the biggest thing you've learned there about where to invest in terms of process development?
So obviously you don't know ahead of time which molecules are going to make it across the finish line and which ones aren't. Obviously, the vast majority fail to get across to the approval stage. I've been fortunate to work on 2 or 3 molecules that have achieved approval, but you don't know ahead of time. And so because of that, you always want to put your best process forward. Every company has a different approach. Some companies have an early stage process development team and a late stage process development team. And because of the high failure rate, aren't willing to invest early on. But what I think has happened in the last 20 years or so, that the technology that is now available to process chemists, whether it be high throughput screening, artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, the barrier to entry is a lot lower towards the goal of getting it right the first time. 25 years ago, people wouldn't want to make the effort to get the commercial process for a phase 1 candidate, right? That was just, it makes no sense because 80% failure, and why invest early on? But I think what's happened more recently is it's a lot easier to think about that approach, the get it right first time approach. And some companies are doing that. Obviously, the bigger pharma companies that have the resources and the access to the technology. But what's been happening is that the CDMOs, the CROs, also have been investing in similar technologies over the last 20 years or so. And so that small pharma companies now have access to that technology, whereas maybe that was only a domain of big pharma back in 2005. As the technology advances, one can invest in a commercial style or commercial type process early on, and then that will save you time and regulatory burden down the road if you have that right process early on.
Finally then, as a last question, let's bring it back to CMOs for a minute and tell me something maybe you wish someone had told you earlier on about what it's like working with external partners.
Sure. I think one of the most important things to know is the value of a good project manager.
That's not internally or externally?
Both, but mostly at the CDMO. I've had it's hard to assess, but when you're doing your due diligence, you should kind of know the bench strength of their PMs. I've had some good ones. I've had some bad ones. I've requested changes in PMs. Because they really are the touch point between the sponsor and the CMO, and so that has been kind of an eye-opening experience along the way for me. And also, in terms of relationship management, treating your CRO as a partner, as opposed to just falling into that sponsor-vendor relationship paradigm. I learned that very early on, and so it's really worth visiting your vendors once or twice a year on site, developing those relationships with the team members. And what that does is it builds camaraderie and it builds a little bit of trust. And so that when you need to have some difficult conversations, as is often the case during any kind of process development, it's just facilitated by having a good relationship and investing in that relationship and spending the time to improve that relationship and maintain it along the way. And those have been a couple of things that I've found to be relevant in that area. And then also understanding that no one's going to care about your project as much as you do. I think some companies feel like they can throw the tech package over the fence and now it's the vendor's problem, but you need to be constantly involved and always driving the research from the sponsor side as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Steve, thanks a lot for your time today and for chatting to me. It's been great.
My pleasure, Dora. It's been great.